Welcome poolside for this special edition of the Carolina Weather Group. I'm James Brierton in a very warm Charlotte, and a happy 4th of July weekend to all of you listening and watching at home or on the road. We're going to be spending this hour showing you some never-before-seen interviews about the hurricane season. Where a reminder, what are hurricane hunters and what do they do? Let's go aboard an aircraft and we'll show you exactly how they fly in to the eye of the storm.
NOAA's Lockheed WP-3D Orion turboprop aircraft slices through a hurricane as nerves inside rattle with every wake of turbulence.
Because as a pilot, I was trained to fly to stay away from bad weather, and now that's my mission, is to fly into bad weather. The plane itself is just a 1976 P-3. It's not structurally enhanced at all. There's a lot of scientific gear in the back that makes it special, but up here, it's pretty much an airliner.
This is a basic drop zone, which instrument we actually launch out of the aircraft. It's expendable. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's about $750. What we do, we launch out of the aircraft and don't recover it, but as it's launched out through the hurricane, it sends back data. Data includes temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, wind speed, wind direction. It transmits it back to the aircraft like a robot. We receive it here and then transmit that data back to the National Hurricane Center, which helps better predict the hurricanes. Hurricane Katrina, the red line was the original track of the hurricane predicted. Once we flew through it and did with including this instrument and other instruments, the green line became the new track, and the black line was the actual track of the hurricane.
And now, without further ado, we begin our series of interviews with National Hurricane Center Director Ken Graham.
All right, we're here at the Hurricane Awareness Tour, and we're with National Hurricane Center Director Ken Graham. Ken, we also want to tell you thank you very much for coming into the inland parts of the Carolinas, and we were talking a little bit off camera. You specifically target this area for the heavy rain threat, so talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the data, 83% of the fatalities in the last 3 years has been from inland flooding. So, you start thinking about that, you start looking at the data, and, this whole hurricane issue, the impacts, it's not just coastal, it really is inland. So we had the idea, we need to hold more of these tours, we need to do more outreach inland, and that's why we picked the inland cities. Let's talk about the heavy rain.
Well, talking about the heavy rain, last year North Carolina experienced Alberto. We had Florence, even some touches of Michael with heavy rain. So as you guys just finished your review of those events, tell us about some of the crazy stats that you saw come out of Florence with the heavy rain threat.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at it because the actual track forecast was pretty much right on track. We did a great job with the track. The intensity forecast is still tough. I mean, we're underdoing it at the beginning, and then we overshot the intensity forecast towards the end. So we still struggle with this whole intensity problem. But here's the deal. Despite the intensity, the impacts were the same. Even with the winds coming down, the impacts didn't change at all. Storm surge. Think about this. 100 miles inland, we have the highest values of the storm surge. I mean, that's something that we talk about. It's not just a coastal threat, it's inland. And that was predicted 4 days ahead of time. The rainfall forecast, almost perfect 5 days ahead of time. So what's happening here? We got good forecasts, but we still have people in the water. So I think there's this other component that we have to talk about, and it's behavioral and social science, getting that information into the forecast as well, and so we can communicate the best we can to get a good response.
And Ken, one thing is we see categories 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A lot of people focus on the wind threat, but it's actually the inland flood threat, the river flooding that happens days afterwards. That's where a lot of focus, I think you guys are trying to focus on as well as we come into this upcoming hurricane season.
Yeah, you just look at the data. I mean, so many people are losing their lives inland from the inland flooding. It's not just coastal. So we are putting an emphasis on that. You think about, some of the new products that we have that concentrate on the impacts, not just the category, because people have to remember, I mean, we talk about it all the time. The category is only the wind. And it's interesting with this Saffir-Simpson scale. If you go from a 4 to a 1, we relax. But if you go from nothing to a 1, we're prepared, right? It's still a 1. So it isn't about just the winds. It really isn't. It's about the size and the speed, which influence the heavy rain, which influence the storm surge. That's what's hurting people, and that's what we got to keep talking about.
So as we look at storms developing in the waters and coming towards the United States coast, take us into your office. What's going on in there? I know you're the director, so maybe kind of tell our folks what you do and what's going on in the Hurricane Center as we're watching these storms approach.
Yeah, people don't realize we're pretty small. There's only 43 people that work at the Hurricane Center. So we're also there 24 hours a day. We're doing the marine forecast for the Atlantic and also the Pacific. So it's a 24-hour watch on what's happening in the tropics. So once you see something, we're talking about it, we're looking at it. If it's a place we need to to investigate, we'll actually assign these aircraft, both the Air Force and NOAA, to go look at those potential areas that could develop. So we're working very close with the hurricane hunters to dispatch the flights. So if it's something that looks like that's going to develop, we start looking at measuring the winds. We got depression and get to a tropical storm and a hurricane. So then it's all about getting a good forecast out, and really that's just part of the equation. The other big part, probably the bigger part to be honest, is getting the information to emergency managers, decision makers, getting into the people that have these really big decisions to make. The better science we can give them, the better decisions they can make, and that means we have a better response from the public and we can save lives.
And speaking of lead time, you guys over the past year or so produced the potential tropical cyclone outlooks, and I'm sure that's been a big help to those emergency managers and those folks who need to make those decisions. Kind of talk to the folks who may not know about that product, what that exactly is.
You know, when somebody hears the potential tropical cyclone product, it may not sound like a big deal, but it really, really is. I mean, if you think about lead time to get ready for a hurricane, it's all about working a timeline. So if we can find a way to extend that timeline, it helps people get ready. And I looked at the data, and if you look at the last 2 to 3 years with the potential tropical cyclone product, over the last couple of years, we've given people on average another 15.5 hours of lead time, as high as 24 hours. So what that does is it gives you an extra day to be able to prepare for a hurricane. So it doesn't sound like much, but it's very meaningful on the ground.
You were talking about outreach earlier. One thing you guys have really got into a lot is the Facebook Lives, the Periscopes, the social media realm. And honestly, that's where a lot of folks are now getting their weather information. So talk to us about that, how you prepare those graphics. And once the storm ramps up, you guys are on Facebook Live, it seems like almost every other hour, giving constant updates. And talk about that and how that's affected those folks who are in the path of the storm.
And you look at where people get information. Social media is just increasing so much throughout time. I mean, I look at my own kids and how much information they get on social media on a regular basis. So, you know, you issue the products, you issue the warnings, and you kind of think about it. It's like, where do we have a conversation about this storm? So we got the idea. So we start going live on social media. And notice it's not just me. You know, I may give the latest and greatest on the storm, but then I'll say, let's go talk to somebody. Let's meet the person that actually is doing the forecast. Let's go meet the people behind the scenes. I think that's important because we care so much about doing a great job to get the forecast out and get the information out. Meet the people doing it. And I think it's an effective way to get information out. Notice they're not scripted. They can be raw. I don't know when I'm going to fall. All those things come to mind. But the reality is, I think it's an effective way to get information out right to everybody, right in their pockets, right to their homes. Let's talk about this storm.
So, Ken, as you are the director of the Hurricane Center, as we get into the 2019 tropical system, what would you like to tell the folks of the Carolinas? What do they need to be on the lookout for? What do they need to get prepared for this tropical season?
You know, 30 years ago we had Hugo, and it really reminds us, you know, you had 100-mile-an-hour winds deep inland with trees down, heavy rain. Look, it's all about those impacts, and the whole entire hurricane season, it only takes one to make it a bad season for the Carolinas. And look, you got to be ready, not just on the coast. I urge everybody, when you close your eyes, don't just see the wind, don't just see the beach. Please see the water, see inland flooding, and be ready to take action if you get those warnings.
All right, Ken, we certainly appreciate a little bit of your time, and
Absolutely.
We hope it's not too active of a season for you.
I'm ready for a quieter season.
All right.
So today we're going to be talking about Flash and everything that it stands for and what y'all do. Can you tell us a little bit about what Flash stands for, first of all?
Absolutely. Well, we started out as the Florida Alliance for Safe Homes, but quickly became the Federal Alliance because we work all over the U.S. as well as the Caribbean and really globally. Our mission is strengthening homes and safeguarding families, and we do that by providing information. We take science and engineering and we bring it through to the street, so to speak, in a way that consumers can understand it. It's a little bit more digestible than maybe when it comes off of the presses from the science side.
Absolutely. So that's going to come with a lot of testing. Do you guys have a laboratory that you test model homes, something like that?
Well, see, the beauty is we don't have to test, but we partner with the academic community where they have the laboratories and the private sector. Mm-hmm. You think about the types of products that make your home resilient, they have some of the best testing labs privately in the country. But what we do is we do risk communication testing. So what we'll do is we'll test drive assumptions for the consumer. Then we'll create messaging. We test drive the messaging for effectiveness, and then we do public outreach to push it out the door.
Okay, that's awesome. So what are the different types of weather that y'all generally try to cover? in terms of safety?
So we focus on all natural hazards, primarily hurricane, flood, tornado, but we also do earthquake and lightning, and then we do winter weather as well. We try to provide a year-round opportunity for people to make their lives better, as well as strengthening their homes by being empowered with good info.
Okay. Do you all help out after storms? So when people are trying to rebuild, is that something that you get involved in?
What we do is on two fronts. First, we send our experts out, engineers and building officials, on the teams that assess building performance. So it's kind of like the NTSB of a hurricane when you're saying, how well did this community survive from a built perspective? Did the roof stay on? Did we have adequate elevation for flood? And we try to be a part of that, and it's a really good system. And then those reports get published, and then we help peer review those. After 2017, we actually helped do a lot of the research for the reports on Maria and Irma, as well as Harvey and others. So we do that, but then on the policy side, the way we help is we like to see programs where homeowners can get grants to harden their home and retrofit and do things to make that roof stay on. Because that's the key in high wind, as you know, is we've got to have the roof to the wall to the foundation, keep the whole thing intact.
Exactly. And so are there actually different locations around the country? I'm sure some places have better infrastructure than others. Are there certain, like the Gulf Coast, for instance, is their infrastructure and their housing, do you find that's generally better or worse because they're in a more hurricane-prone area?
Well, the starting point for all good building performance and the predictor of performance is building codes, and they are different all over the country. So because of that, we're trying to bring more transparency to the building code issue by providing information. We just now, for hurricane season this year, launched for the first time ever a consumer-facing web portal where you can go in and look up your address and see what kind of building code is adopted where you live. It's a huge undertaking. It'll be a multi-year project. So we're starting with residential codes and we're starting with current codes. And instead of giving you a lot of technical gobbledygook, if as a family you don't want that, we'll give you a red, yellow, green analysis. Says green because your community has a code adopted today. Yellow, they have a code adopted, but it might be out of date. And red is fire alarm. You have no building code adopted where you live, so you've got to do something differently to make sure. The campaign is called No Code, No Confidence, and then you come to inspecttoprotect.org to look and see what you have. That's really the first thing that you need to do to understand, how is my house going to be in a fill-in-the-blank, earthquake, flood, hurricane, tornado.
And for people that realize that maybe their house isn't up to code, what are their next steps?
Well, the thing they need to do is get an inspection. We actually have some DIY inspections. So you can start off slowly, asking some basic questions about things around the house that you can go and take pictures of and understand, what you have. And then our process and everything we have as a nonprofit is free. So you can call us. And then if you get to that point where you want to have a home inspection, we can give your home inspector an addendum list to make sure he looks at the right, or she looks at the right things. And then you just have to move through the process, and figure it out. But it's something we want you to start thinking about now while the weather's good, because think of the decisions that key off of your building performance. Should I stay or should I go?
Absolutely.
Am I safe here? Are my kids safe here? What about your largest single investment, which is your home? Is it going to be around? There's a whole host of things you have to do to prepare, but when it comes to the house, you have to get to know your house.
Absolutely, and it's been a rough few years for homeowners along the coast. We've had Harvey and Michael and Matthew, and it's just this is definitely a major issue in these times. And as we're entering hurricane season, like you said, now is the time to act.
We want people to know, though, and in some cases, our research tells us that people think there's nothing they can do. That is not the case, and that's what we're here to help them figure out. There are plenty of things you can do, some yourself, some with the help of others, but they can come to us and we'll help them figure out where to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Cool.
All right, we're here with Daniel Brown with the National Hurricane Center. And Daniel, North Carolina native, so went to school at UNC Asheville, so welcome back. We're glad to have you. And so talk to us a little bit about what you do at the Hurricane Center.
Sure, I'm one of the senior hurricane specialists, also serve as the warning coordination meteorologist at the center. So during the hurricane season, I'm one of the forecasters putting out those tropical storm and hurricane forecasts. during the off season, I'm coordinating a lot of our outreach and education efforts, which we do a tremendous amount of between January and May.
Yeah, and so I believe you guys are just coming off of having some emergency managers and meteorologists coming in. Kind of talk to us about that program and how that really helps out not only you guys, but also folks who are back here in the Carolinas and along the East and the Gulf Coast.
Sure. The off season for us is really the outreach and education season. One of our former directors said, Max Mayfield said, that the battle of the hurricane is actually won during the off season, and it's really true because we provide so much training. It's when we need to get prepared for the next season. But we actually do about 10 weeks of training at the Hurricane Center. We have 3 weeks that we train emergency managers from the Gulf, Southeast, and Northeast United States. We take that course on the road for a couple of weeks. We bring in other meteorologists. We actually, this week at the Hurricane Center, are training meteorologists from around the Caribbean. We have a couple from the Far East as well. And so we provide that training, and then we have training for our own National Weather Service folks. We're all in this together. We want everybody to be able to message the events, especially provide that decision support to emergency managers. And so we, again, provide all this training during the off season.
And speaking of messaging, you guys have really become vocal on social media, which a lot of folks have. Talk about that outreach and just how it's really helped out the folks who have been in the path of the storms over the past couple of years.
Sure, we're trying more and more to reach folks with social media, especially the younger generation. That's the way they're getting a lot of their messages. So we're using it to tweet and put on Facebook information about storms that might form, where they might be going. So follow us on social media. One thing that we've started to do the last few years is we put together key messages. These are really those top 3 or 4 things that we want you to take away from that forecast, from that advisory, things that you need to be concerned about. And we're taking those and putting those in a graphic on social media. So follow along this hurricane season. We're one of those trusted sources. Follow your local National Weather Service office as well.
And Daniel, talking about the graphics that you guys produce, the cone of uncertainty, which is what we've termed it as. A lot of folks, if they see a center line and that's where they think that the hurricane's going to be, kind of talk to us about the uncertainty and how that can shift and how everyone needs to be on alert if you live anywhere near a storm.
Well, absolutely. So a lot of people think the cone of uncertainty tells where the impacts are going to be, and it doesn't. It really tells you nothing about the impacts. It's only telling you where the center of the storm is likely to track. We designed it in such that about a third of the time the center can actually move outside the cone. So even if you're near the edge of the cone or just outside the cone, be aware, be alert. Oftentimes, as we get closer to the event where the cone gets really narrow, impacts are always occurring outside the cone. Storm surge, heavy rainfall, winds. And so you really want to start looking more at the watches and warnings that are in effect. Look at some of the other graphics we produce where it tells you your risk of winds. Listen to your local media. That's the advice. We really want folks to be focused on the hazards, not storm category, not storm track, but on the hazards.
And talking about that, the intensity forecast you guys produce and the track forecast, you guys monitor those every year after every storm season, and the track forecast was pretty spot on last year.
Yes, we continue to make improvements in our track forecast. In fact, the last couple seasons have been very good. 2017, we set record low track errors at all times. And even during some of the bigger storms we've had, the Harveys, the Irma, the Maria, the Florence, and Michael, we've had very low track errors, which is great. We still struggle sometimes with forecasting intensity, but again, don't get too overly confident in those tracks because, again, hazards extend far from the center. Hurricane's not a point, and we have to be aware of that as well.
And talking of those hazards here in the Carolinas, we see a lot of flash flooding from tropical systems. Talk to our folks about that and why we need to be paying attention. Even if you live in the Piedmont or in the mountains of the Carolinas, you still need to be paying attention to that track.
Absolutely. That's one of the key messages that we're taking along with us this week, and we really want folks to be thinking about. Historically, most deaths in hurricanes are from water, not wind. And the last few years, over 80% of the deaths has been from inland flooding. And a lot of these are preventable. We really need to be paying better attention when we're out traveling before or during and after a storm. Because we're seeing a lot of folks die in vehicles. Over half those deaths have been people in vehicles, and it's people that don't have enough fear for the water, I think. They're driving around barricades, they see a flooded roadway, and they think it's more important to get to the event that they're heading to than their life. And we have to change that. It's not acceptable that we're seeing this number of fatalities. We all need to be collectively taking an effort to reduce that. The key message is turn around, don't drown.
And so, Daniel, as we wrap up here, we're about a month away before the official start of hurricane season. What's your advice to those folks who live in the Carolinas? What should they be doing now as we anticipate the beginning June 1st?
Sure. As bad as the last few hurricane seasons have been here for the Carolinas with Matthew, and we had Florence this past year, we can't let our guard down. I really hope it's not an impactful season in the Carolinas this year. But if it is, let's be ready. We have to take each and every hurricane season, each and every storm seriously. It's easier to do the preparation now than it is when the hurricane is threatening. So my advice is to really find out if you live in an evacuation zone, get your food and water, your supplies ready before June 1st, and then just know what you're going to do. If you live in a flood-prone area, find someone that lives outside that area that you could stay with in case we do get that significant either storm surge or inland flooding.
All right, Daniel Brown from the National Hurricane Center, we appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
I'm glad to be here today with you, Rob. And just as we get started, just tell us a little bit about the aircraft behind us here.
So this is the mighty P-3 Orion. It's a uniquely instrumented aircraft for hurricane research and reconnaissance. It's Navy. Well, it comes from the Navy P-3,
right,
which we have taken from the manufacturer and uniquely instrumented for the research that we do. Some of the unique features of our plane are our lower fuselage radar, which is a multi-mode radar that can actually lower in flight and scan 360 degrees around the plane as we're flying along. And that data can then go directly to the National Hurricane Center for use in their research models. In addition to that, on the tail, we have the tail Doppler radar, which is a unique radar that actually scans vertically 360 degrees and takes a slice of the storm as we're flying through, both before and after the plane. So by taking 2 scans, it actually allows us to do a 3-dimensional view of that storm as we're flying through it and measure those updrafts and downdrafts of the storm and measure those dynamics, which goes towards predicting the strengthening or weakening of that storm.
That's awesome, man. How many of these do you guys have in your fleet?
We have 2 P3s. This one's Kermit the Frog, and his partner, Miss Piggy, is at home getting ready for the hurricane season. So this radar underneath our plane is our multi-mode radar. And that actually can lower in flight. That whole radar dish lowers below the plane to clear it from any interference of the plane and can scan 360 degrees around as we fly. So it's just like the radar that you might have on your phone or that you might get from the National Weather Service. And it's a X-band radar, which is a highly detailed radar for close range measurements. So with that, we've actually just incorporated that into the plane within the last couple of years. And as we're flying into these storms, what we're seeing is that additional detail that's provided by that new radar is allowing us to see never before seen mesovortices within that eye wall that help explain why certain areas of that storm are more violent than others.
Wow. And how long have you been piloting aircraft?
So I've been flying planes for about 15 years. I've been with NOAA for 10 and flying into hurricanes for about 5.
And how many hurricanes do you think you've been into? I mean, surely a lot.
We don't typically track the number of named storms because we go into them so often, but what we do track is the number of times we've passed into and out of the eye wall of a storm. So I have 48 passes into and out of an eye wall that I've physically flown the plane through, and I've probably been on board for about double that, so about 100.
And out of all those missions, what's one that really stands out to you?
Well, your first mission is always special. So my first mission was Hurricane Cristobal back in 2014. And that one was unique in that it was a small tropical storm that increased to a hurricane. It didn't really impact the United States, but for whatever reason, that storm had more lightning than I've ever seen in my life. So flying through that storm, it was like going through a disco ball with all that lightning going on. The other more unique one that really impacted us was Hurricane Irma. So we flew that storm as it went north of Cuba and went through the Caribbean. And as it was starting to threaten our home in Lakeland, Florida, that one was a strong, beautiful Category 5 storm, but we were flying it straight to our own home. So our forecast was dictating how that prediction was turning either the west coast or east coast of Florida and how it was going to impact our home. So we would fly the mission, then go home and prepare ourselves for it.
And you bring up a good point. And walk us through what it's like in the day of a NOAA pilot. From the time that there's a storm recognition to hey, we may need to deploy on this storm and to actual launch.
Absolutely. So the National Hurricane Center is constantly monitoring the pressure systems as they go across the Atlantic. And when they identify something that has the potential for development, they'll start tasking us through CARCA, which is one of their partner organizations with the Air Force. So they'll dictate who gets to go where and launch us out into the storm. Oftentimes, we'll pre-deploy out to Barbados or St. Croix in order to get further out into that the Atlantic and catch those storms even earlier. Once we do that, we'll typically try to do 24-hour operations, which for one plane, if we have that out there, we'll do 2 crews and launch typically once every 12 hours. Our typical mission flight is about 8 to 10 hours long, so we'll fly out for 8 to 10 hours, land, refuel the plane, get a new crew going, and do it right again.
That's awesome. Now, when you guys go out, are you guys doing low-level reconnaissance or upper mid-level reconnaissance, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So our typical mission involves flying at 8 to 10,000 feet to measure all 4 quadrants of the storm. So we'll do what we call a figure 4 pattern or a rotated figure 4 pattern, which involves making an X, typically from the southwest to the northeast, and then we go with the winds around to the northwest and then back to the southeast. And oftentimes we'll rotate that about 45 degrees and do it all over again. So what that does, it allows us to measure each quadrant of the storm and measure the dynamics as the storm is strengthening and weakening. In addition to that, what's unique to the NOAA mission is that we will go out there with a research prerogative. So we have scientists that try to figure out what the next latest and greatest forecasting technique or feature of the storm that they need to measure in order to better predict these storms in the future. So we may go out there and focus on the outer rain bands or brand new developing storms or decaying storms, try to figure out what makes them tick and how we can better forecast those in the future.
That's great. And a couple more things about the aircraft here. How much? What's the weight on this aircraft? I think these were originally designed submarines for the Navy.
Absolutely. So this is a former P-3 submarine hunter, but we use it for the weather. So we can take off at up to 135,000 pounds, which includes about a little over 60,000 pounds of gas. So that gas allows us to fly for 12, 13 hours if we really had to, and take this plane over 4,000 miles into the storm.
Right. And I noticed the boom off the front. Are you guys air-to-air refuel capable?
Nope, not air-to-air. We're not doing jousting with that. But what that is it's a gust probe. So that, and now we use the wing probe that's off of our left-hand wing, and we use that to measure the winds at the altitude that we're at. So as we go into the center of the storm, we're trying to find where that wind turns to zero, right where the storm is, right at the center of the storm. And we got to know where the storm is to predict where the storm's going to go in the future.
That's right. Now, one last question here. Once you break into that eye wall and you penetrate and you get in there and you see that stadium effect, personally, what is it like for you to see that?
I tell you what, it's quite the contradiction in that that stadium effect really only happens in the most severe Category 5 storms. Some of those Category 2, 3, 4 storms, they still have a lot of thunderstorms in the middle. So even as you break through into the eye wall, you may still have to be ducking and diving some of that internal convection. But that Category 5 stadium effect is pretty awesome. You don't get to see that any other time.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right, we're here with NBC Charlotte meteorologist Larry Sprinkle, Charlotte's weatherman, Larry.
Thank you. I'm not sure about that, but I've been hanging around a long time now.
You have. You're a very friendly face to a lot of folks here in the Carolinas, and we are out here at the Hurricane Awareness Tour, and so I wanted to ask you, you've been here in the Carolinas a long time. Any memorable hurricanes?
Let's see. Is there one? Maybe 1989, September, 30th anniversary of Hurricane Hugo. And obviously, this is going in my 35th year. I've seen and covered quite a few, but that one specifically impacted me directly because the morning that actually hit Charlotte, at the station we had a limited staff. We had 2 of us in the weather department, Steve Raleigh and myself, and just a nucleus of people to run the station. So there were maybe 12 people at the most in the station. So they decided to lock a camera down in the studio. So the meteorologist is on air with a lockdown camera. Steve was taking a break, and I think it was maybe 4:20-ish in the morning. We'd been outside, inside. We knew that the run of the storm was hitting, and I'll never forget the camera was like here in front of me. And off to my left is the main part of the studio. And so I'm talking, and I'm saying, we've had reports of wind gusts over 90 miles an hour near Shaw Air Force Base, winds over 70 miles an hour in Charlotte. And about that time, I could hear something off to my left, kind of a creaking sound. And then all of a sudden, I looked over, and about 500 pounds of ceiling came in right next to me. So the camera didn't pick it up, but I'm like this. The camera is here, but my eyes are like this. And part of the ceiling just caved in front of me. Back to you guys in the newsroom. So it went back to our news anchor at the time, Rick Jackson. And so Rick goes, his camera's back on him. He goes, Larry, let me ask you a question. Larry was on his hands and knees crawling. Took me 2 seconds to get out of the studio. But yeah, what happened was we had a big tower next to the building, a 1,200-foot tower. The guy wires that came down one snap, and about 1,000 pounds of it hit the roof. And so that pushed the ceiling into the studio. So I thought I was going to be the first weather guy to go in the act. But luckily I got that. But yeah, that's you can't forget that.
Absolutely, and obviously that hurricane was intense, but not just on the shore, but also inland. Places like Charlotte. For our viewers that don't know, why exactly was that those strong winds made it so far into the land?
I mean, I think that atmospherically, you had everything in place it took. You had obviously a hurricane, Category 4 hurricane off the coast of Charleston. You had a big area of high pressure off the coast of New England, area of low pressure in the Gulf of Mexico. Those steered that storm right across Charleston, right into the Midlands of South Carolina, making that turn more to the north, right over Charlotte, then right over Hickory, and then just on a beeline up the Ohio Valley. I mean, it was atmospherically things that you just don't see that often.
It was just moving so quickly.
It was, yeah, absolutely.
And Larry, last year we had Florence that moved through the area, had a lot of flooding. Talk to us about that a little bit.
I mean, that in particular, when you see the inland flooding that, maybe it's a century ago that happened when you had, once again, the atmosphere that loaded with moisture. And that was, Florence was devastating. And when we saw the reports from our reporters, the video that we had, the drone shots of all that flooding, I mean, that's heartbreaking. And even though it's exciting as weather folk to cover hurricanes and storms, when you see that, you say, I never want to see it again. I never want to cover this kind of thing again, but obviously that's going to happen again, and I pray that we don't see anything like that here this year again.
All right. Well, Larry, we appreciate you joining us.
Thanks
and
for what you guys do.
Great
job.
For everything you do for us.
Thank you.
Okay. And how long have you been a pilot?
Been a pilot since the early 2000s. Flew Blackhawks in the Army first.
Right.
And then made a switch to WC-130s about 7 years ago.
What made you want to switch from rotor wing to fixed wing?
Well, the Army is a good place for a while, but that's a young man's game.
Right.
I was hoping to fly C-130s. The Hurricane Hunters were right down the street. They had an opportunity, so I took it. So and it's been never looked back.
Right. Now, in your aviation experience, how many type aircraft have you flown?
Oh, wow. We can go through them.
I mean, just
yeah.
we can go over the big ones. How about that?
Yeah, so like flew to Huey, flew to Black Hawk, multiple variants of the civilian. I flew helicopters offshore. And then for the Air Force, just the T6, the T1, and the C-130, a couple of different variants of the C-130.
Huey or C-130?
Oh, fun to fly, be helicopters all day. But getting up, going somewhere, being in a different time zone, definitely C-130s.
Right. Now, when you guys, get ready, mission ready, once tropical season comes around, how does your schedule work as far as, from the time that you guys may have to go recon a storm to actual launch time?
Yeah, great question. We have an agreement with the National Hurricane Center. We have a 16-hour response time. So basically, you're sitting around. The plan of the day, the pod is what they call it, comes in and says, hey, we definitely want y'all to go fly. So depending on where the storm is, we're taking off and going to fly it that very next day, and we'll fly it till the storm dies out. If it's in Hawaii, that obviously takes a couple of more days to get there. So they'll usually give us a couple of days response time. We definitely want you to get out there, and we'll load 3 airplanes, crews, and people and go. But it happens pretty quick. If you've never seen it, new people that'll come in, it looks like mass chaos and doesn't look very organized, but it seems to work. It's just how it is.
Now, your average missions that you fly, I know that's going to be really dependent on where the storm is, but you go out to the Caribbean or something. Walk us through one of those missions.
Yeah, so a mission, the average mission is about 9 to 10 hours, depending on how far it is away. So we'll just use flying in. Let's use Hurricane Florence that came through last year. We moved to Savannah with 3 aircraft crews, and we were hitting the storm when it was about 6 hours away. So basically 5.5 hours to get there, a couple hours, and then fly back. So those missions were long, 12, 13 hours. So as it moves in, you can stay in a storm environment longer. Hurricane Florence, when it was hitting the coast, I flew it for about 7 hours on my last flight. As it was making landfall, they were concerned about how strong the wind was on the backside, so we continued to fly it all the way.
Right. Now for Florence, were you guys launching from Bermuda or Savannah?
Florence.
Gotta love it.
Yeah. So for Hurricane Florence, we moved to Savannah. So we started flying immediately off of Savannah. We knew they basically, as soon as we flew it the first time, they made a projection. I think within 10 miles, they knew where it was going to hit. It's pretty accurate.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Now tell for some of the viewers that don't really know a whole lot about airplanes, about your aircraft here.
Yeah. So this is a WC-130J, C-130 coming off the assembly line. We add a few things to it, little pieces of equipment that make it a W. It's a big tank. The J variant is an upgrade. If you could see the props, these props, 6-bladed props. If y'all look at the NOAA plane later, it still has the 4 like boat paddle props. Upgraded engines, 4,700 horsepower per engine, a lot of thrust. We can take off 165,000 pounds. If war was going on, the president could waive it to 175,000. So a lot of weight can come off of this aircraft. We normally fly around topped off on gas, close to 60,000 pounds, which give us a max loitering time and a little slop on each side. So we have to be super precise on our flight
Now,
time.
does the Hercules have air-to-air refuel capability?
No, thank God it doesn't, because if our aircraft did, they want us to air-to-air refuel, and we would never land.
I understand that. As far as some of the weather systems that you may have on board.
Yeah, so the biggest thing for us, other than the meteorologists, them being the weather weapon, I'm going to start calling them a weather weapon, but those guys themselves interpreting the weather and sending it back to the National Hurricane Center. We use a drop sign. Basically, a sign falls from the bottom of the aircraft about 2,500 feet a minute. And as it's falling, it's getting temperature, dew point, wind speeds, big thing. Pressure is the real big thing. And as it falls, it goes all the way to surface, and it's sending information back. That's our go-to ticket. We have a couple of other instruments. The Smurf. I can lie to you, it's the Smurf. It's the Step Meteor. Yeah, it has a long acronym. It was built in Massachusetts by some really smart guys. But it's actually looking at waves and as they crash, and it's measuring temperature and gives us a wind speed. Really upper level cerebral stuff.
Right. That's really cool. As far as missions, what's been a mission that really sticks out in your head?
Yeah. So I have 2. My first mission flew through a tornado, a mesocyclone. And the aircraft was flying itself. Actually, the mesocyclone was flying the aircraft, not us, because we would, going back and imagine driving down the interstate and you're, moving your wheel and the wheels aren't turning. Yeah, it was kind of the same thing. That was an unfun situation. Also, Hurricane Maria a couple of years ago, the winds were 250 miles an hour blowing through the mountains, and you're down at 10,000 feet, and you're getting this mechanical turbulence. Just you can envision just kind of vortexing at us, and man, it gets hit. And I tell people it felt like the only thing I can equate it to would be like a 60,000 pound donkey kicking the side of the aircraft. It was awful, and that's 3 o'clock in the morning. Most people aren't at their best at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, that's right. When you guys are flying, do you guys A, fly low-level reconnaissance missions, and B, are you always on the autopilot or FMS, or are you hand flying the aircraft?
Great question. So initially, when the National Hurricane Center is looking at these storms, they see a disturbance, and they just see the satellite picture, right? So we'll go out there and fly it and try to get the cyclone. If we see cyclone all quadrants, they'll name it. So we initially start out at 500 feet. One time, quick story, popping out of the clouds. Boom, it was a cruise ship under us. You kind of fly by and wave at everybody. But once the storm gets stronger, 80 knots and above, we'll climb up in altitude. We'll get to 5,000, we'll get to 10,000. And we do use autopilot as much as possible. It just relieves us, and we don't get as exhausted, I guess you could say. But at some point, the autopilot just can't keep up with the turbulence, so we have to hand fly it.
Now, is this a fly-by-wire aircraft?
No. This is a 1957's technology. This is a 1997 model, which is a great aircraft, but it goes, straight pulley and that type of system, pulley assisted, I guess.
Right. All right. Now, when you guys are doing eyewall penetrations, tell me what it's like to see the stadium effect, where you get the banding around the eyewall.
Yeah. So. When we're flying towards a storm, we're dropping down 150 miles out from the eye. You're flying along and it's bumpy. And finally, the fruits of your labor, if it's a strong storm, like a Maria, Irma, Cat 5, you pop out in the middle, it's the most beautiful thing you can imagine. That Coriolis effect pulling all the clouds away from the center. I mean, it's just calm. Beautiful as it is today. You fly around, kind of enjoy it, get up, go to the bathroom if you need to, fix your food, and then you got a game on getting out the other side. So.
Yep. Now I'm going to finish this up with one last question. When you do the eyewall penetrations, I know I fly small aircraft, and You know, we go off altimeter settings for autopilot, stuff like that. Is the Herc the same way? So, you know, you may be flying around at 9,000 feet in eyewall penetration. Next thing you know, you're at 6,000 feet?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we'll set our altimeters at 299 or 2, standard pressure. And sure enough, as you, aviation world, they say high to low, look out below. That's right. Because the lower it is, it's going to bring you down in altitude. So the stronger it is, it's very low inside of that. So when I first started flying them, as you're going through the eyewall, that it's getting a lower pressure, so the aircraft it's on autopilot is going, it wants it right now.
Right.
And so I've seen a difference of a couple of thousand feet. So if you're around Puerto Rico or Cuba mountains, right, you get low, you got to be real cognizant of that.
I bet that's a great ride.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, man.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Chris, that was
yes,
great,
sir.
Man. Appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
All right, so Michael, we're here at the National Hurricane Center Awareness Tour. You guys have been along the East Coast throughout the rest of this week, and you continue tomorrow. Talk to us a little bit about the tour and the goals for it.
Well, the goal is really, you know, people obviously want to come out and see the aircraft and talk to the folks who fly into the hurricanes, but that's a way to we can use that to bring people out here and talk to them about hurricane awareness and get them ready for the season. So we started off in near Providence, Rhode Island, then we went to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Roanoke, Virginia, here in Charlotte, and then we go to Brunswick, Georgia next. So we purposely decided to hit some inland communities this trip to raise the awareness of the inland flooding threat. We've had a lot of inland flooding fatalities due to tropical cyclones in the United States in the last few years. You go back to Harvey and then Hurricane Florence last year. So, you know, in Charlotte, this is the 30th anniversary of Hurricane Hugo this year, which was more of a wind event, but as a hurricane all the way into the Charlotte area, it caused a lot of damage and a lot of power outages, really a big impact for this region.
So talk to us a little bit about what you do there at the Hurricane Center.
So I supervise the group of hurricane forecasters. We have 10 forecasters, and we're the ones who are issuing all the watches and warnings and forecasts for all the tropical storms and hurricanes in the Atlantic and then also in the Eastern Pacific. So I'm sort of in charge of the overall forecast operation. I don't do a lot of forecasts myself anymore, but during big events, I'm involved behind the scenes with coordination with all the local weather service offices or other countries about watches and warnings and impacts. I do a lot of the tasking of the aircraft and make sure they're in the right place and ready to help us and get us the data we need. I do a lot of messaging, trying to get the messaging out to the national level media and then sort of really focus on the hazards. You know, we want to try to deflect away from sort of the storm details, you know, how strong is the peak winds, where is the storm exactly forecast to go, and really focus on the storm surge, the wind, the flooding, rainfall, tornado hazards, what actually affect people. I also do a lot of briefings for the FEMA, state emergency managers, a lot of behind the scenes work to get them ready for the event.
Something we've not really talked much about today is storm surge. So talk to us a little bit about storm surge for our followers along the Carolina coast. And you guys have actually started doing some storm surge warnings and watches and things like that.
Yeah, in 2017 we introduced a specific watch and warning for storm surge because before that they'd sort of been combined in with the hurricane watch and warning, which we typically issued for wind. But storm surge is a different hazard. You want a different response. That's what drives most of the evacuations that are ordered for hurricanes. So in areas where there's the danger of life-threatening storm surge, we want to really highlight that and help the emergency managers get those people evacuated out. Storm surge has the capacity to cause the biggest loss of life in tropical cyclones in this country. You know, going back to Hurricane Katrina, we had over 300 people die from storm surge along the coast of Mississippi. In Florence, we had a tremendous storm surge, not only along the immediate coast, but well inland along the Neuse River up into the New Bern area. So it's not just an immediate coastal threat, especially in the North Carolina coast and the Pamlico and Albemarle Sounds. You can get a lot of storm surge up into those rivers, and the coast of South Carolina near Charleston down to Hilton Head, very vulnerable to storm surge. So people need to know if they live in a storm surge evacuation zone, because that's going to form the basis of your hurricane preparedness plan. If you're going to be asked to evacuate your house, you got to know where you're going to go, what you're going to take, how you're going to get there. This is the time to plan all that out before the season starts.
And you guys are kind of coming off your off season where you've went over and reviewed some things. Any new products, anything we can expect out of the Hurricane Center this year?
We don't have a whole lot of new products. We've introduced a lot just in the last couple of years. The storm surge watch warning, like we talked about. We introduced a time of arrival graphic last year that showed the earliest reasonable and most likely times when tropical storm force winds could begin at a certain location. And that's really valuable for knowing when you need to have your preparations done by, when emergency managers are going to have their evacuations complete. But again, you know, going into this season, you just want to be aware of your risk for all the hazards, whether it's inland flooding, storm surge, wind, and have that plan in place as we get into the season.
And one way you guys are doing that is the key messages and every Hurricane Center update that comes out. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for key messages, we sort of started to introduce those 3 or 4 years ago to try to focus everybody on sort of the important points that we want to get across for each storm, which vary. You know, what are the most important hazards going to be? Talk about the uncertainty, talk about how the risk is changing with time, or if there's any sort of complications to the forecast that might affect how the hazards are going to change. So we really try to use those. We think about like what crawls on the bottom of your television screen, or what kind of news alerts are you going to get on your cell phone, and sort of what are the few pieces of information that we want to sort of be high-level talking points about the storm. So that's what we really have in mind when we create those, and we put them in a graphic on our website with some graphical products that we sort of want to convey information with. So, and that sort of drives the whole picture, the whole national level messaging about the storm. And we start off really early, sometimes even days before a storm arrives, talking about how the threat's increasing or changing, encouraging people to look at their hurricane plan, and then talk about sort of broad scale hazard information. And then when we get into that watch warning time frame, we can get more specific with what areas might see the worst storm surge or the worst winds, or what the rainfall is going to be, and where that flooding might be the worst.
And so as we wrap up here, for those folks who may find themselves in the cone of uncertainty this year in the Carolinas, what's your advice to them? What should they be looking for from your products? And in general, what should we be prepared for as we enter the tropical season?
Well, every year if you live in a hurricane-prone area, you have to be prepared to be hit all the time. Just because if the season's quiet or busy, it doesn't matter. Everybody only cares about what happens where they are or where their friends and loved ones are. So you also have to realize that the cone only tells you about where the center of the storm might go. The hurricane is not a point on a map. It's a big storm. It's going to have hazards that's going to extend well away from the center. It could have hazards that occur hundreds of miles inland from where the storm initially makes landfall. So you can have a storm that makes landfall on the Gulf Coast, can cause catastrophic flooding in the Carolinas a few days later, hundreds of miles away. So again, know what your risk is to those hazards, have your plan in place, think about how you're going to take care of yourself, but also your friends and your relatives. Anybody who has special needs, they might need help getting their house ready, might need help evacuating. Think about those that have medical conditions. How are you going to take care of the people that you care about as the storm approaches? And do all that now before the season starts.
All right, Michael, we appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Alrighty, Warren, we are here today at the airport here in Charlotte. We're going to chat a little bit about CARCA. First, can you tell us what CARCA is? Because that's quite the long acronym.
It is. Chief Aerial Reconnaissance Coordination, All Hurricanes. So we're a three-person Air Force unit embedded in the National Hurricane Center. I work for the 53rd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron, the Hurricane Hunter Squadron, and our job is to coordinate all of the action that happens with aircraft recon. So every morning during storm season, myself and one of my co-workers, we go across the hall to talk to the forecasters and say, what are your needs for recon today? And many days they'll say, no, we're good, that things are quiet, that's good. And then we'll go back and we'll continue to work with both the Air Force and the NOAA squadrons on training missions, because as you might imagine, flying into hurricanes is not your ordinary everyday mission, so there's a lot of training involved to make sure we can continue to do it as safely as we do. But then there are the days where let's say, yes, there's a storm out there that threatens land and we need to get some more information on it via recon, or it might be a situation where there's a suspicious area of thunderstorms, say in the Gulf of Mexico, and they're not sure exactly what's happening under those thunderstorms, and they'll say, we need you to go out there at very low level, like 1,000, 1,500 feet above the surface, and look to see on the sea surface patterns if there's a closed circulation. So then I work with the squadrons to assign those missions out, and then as the missions fly, both squadrons are sending all their data back from the aircraft to my office in the National Hurricane Center via satellite link. And then we look at that information, make sure it makes sense in terms of quality control, and we provide it across the hall to the forecasters so they can use that as part of their forecasting and advisory process. And it also goes out to the world so the media and the public have access to know what's happening with the planes inside that storm.
So in terms of the quality assurance that you're just talking about, that's going to be a lot of data that you're ingesting. How do you all deal with that much data and make sure that it's all reasonable?
Well, there's some, of course, it's a matter of triage. There's some areas that we don't look at as much, but certain key areas, like for example, when the plane is flying through the center of a storm, they're collecting data all the way in on the inbound leg about the surface winds, the speed of the flight level winds, looking at the lowest pressure, the diameter of the eye, and that's transmitted back from the aircraft to the Hurricane Center in what's called the vortex message. And so that is the key component of what the Hurricane Center is looking at. So we do a very thorough once-over, basically looking at all of the other data that the plane's sending to us to cross-check to make sense. Then we're also looking at the broader picture. So we're looking at satellite pictures, shore data, if the storm's close enough, surface radar data to just make sure that the data that the plane is sending in cross-checks with that, because we want to, of course, make sure that the data we're presenting to the forecasters is as accurate as possible, because as we know, garbage in, garbage out. So we just want to make sure that we minimize, if not completely eliminate, the possibility of garbage in.
Absolutely. So how many planes are there in the fleet that y'all coordinate?
With the Air Force Squadron, there's 10 aircraft total, 10 WC-130J Hercules, and then on the NOAA side, there's a total of 3 aircraft, the 2 P-3 Orions, and then there's also a Gulfstream aircraft that is not a aircraft that flies through the storm, but instead it flies around the storm and also out ahead of the storm, dropping numerous, a couple of dozen drop sondes, instruments that sense meteorological information from 45,000 feet down to the surface to gather more information about the steering currents that are pushing the storm along.
Wow, so that's I didn't even realize that went out in front of it like that. So let's talk about the winter storms.
Sure.
Y'all do very interesting work in that. I don't think many people realize that y'all actually fly planes out to ingest data about that.
Right. A lot of people say, well, what do you do during the off season? And it's like, well, we do have missions. And one of those missions, during the season, our customer is the National Hurricane Center. During the winter season, our customer is the National Centers of Environmental Prediction in Washington, D.C. So let's say, for example, there's a nor'easter that's forecast to get going and run up the east coast and perhaps affect the Outer Banks or into the mid-Atlantic or in New England. The heavy snow band in those storms is typically only 100 to 200 miles wide, and since the track of the storm tends to be parallel to the coast, only a small change in the track of the storm can have massive implications of where that heavy snow band will fall. So NCEP asks us to go out and fly it as high as we can, which in our planes is about 30,000 feet, and drop sondes, those instruments I was mentioning earlier, in long tracks out in the areas ahead of the storm to gather more information about all the steering currents, the thermodynamics of the atmosphere, with the hope that what they will do, that all that data gets ingested into the computer models. So hopefully that will help squeeze instead of the usual massive spaghetti that we usually see with models, to have those start clumping up, and that will help the forecasters pinpoint that exact forecast track they're going to go with, and that will help them determine whether or not the big snow is going to fall right over the major city corridor, or if it stays out to sea, or if it lands inland, heading up toward the Appalachians.
Do you only fly in the Gulf of Mexico, or do you also fly off the East Coast?
Our actual area of responsibility for the tropical mission is all the way from east to the Leeward and Windward Islands, all the way west to Hawaii. For the winter storm mission, East Coast and Gulf for the Atlantic, and we have been doing some research projects in the Pacific, and maybe genning that back up. We used to do that in the past, and then it dropped off for a while, but we may be going back to that in the future, depending upon the results of the research.
Okay, absolutely. And actually, I want to wrap back around to the question that I forgot earlier. How do y'all coordinate? So when you're going into a hurricane, there's a lot of missions going out. How frequently do those go out, and over how many days does that typically happen?
So if a storm is not forecast to threaten land, they will not task any recon missions. That's not a good use of resources. Now, it may be determined that the scientists will say they'd still like to fly the storm for science purposes, and the NOAA airplane will go out. But once it's determined that the forecast track will affect land, and land being, of course, anywhere from the Leeward and Windward Islands all the way west to Hawaii, then we'll start flying what we call 12-hourlies, where there'll be a mission out twice a day, and each aircraft will go out, do 2 passes through the storm, so you're sampling all 4 quadrants, and then come on home. Because usually those missions, our typical missions will last 8 to 10 hours, could go as long as 12, and so depending upon how far out the storm is, you've got to get out there, and prop planes are not the fastest of aircraft, about 350 miles an hour getting out there, and then doing time in the storm and then coming back. So then as the storm gets closer to land, we go to what is called a 6-hourly cycle, where we'll have 2 planes still go out a day, but each one will stay a full 6 hours in the storm and crisscross 4 times through the storm to get multiple samples and see how the storm is evolving. And then finally, when the storm is about very close to land, about to make landfall, we go to our 3-hourly cycle, where pretty much we have a plane in the storm at all times.
Okay. Wow, that's amazing stuff. Thank you so much, Warren.
Sure thing, not a problem.
All right, we're here at the National Hurricane Center Awareness Tour. We're with Steve Wilkinson, the meteorologist in charge at GSP, and probably the biggest office that we work with. So, Steve, thank you for having us out. And one thing we're doing today is awareness about tropical season coming up. And one thing many folks in western North Carolina, upstate of South Carolina may not realize is we can also see tropical products issued for our area.
Sure. Well, the actual storms can come this far inland, and they're certainly weakened as they do. But one of the things we've done the last year is actually be able to issue wind products that are called tropical storm warnings or hurricane warnings in a worst-case scenario. And the reason for that is we want a consistency of message. If you've got some hurricane coming ashore or a tropical storm and you're putting out a wind advisory, which was all we could do in the past, then there's kind of a mixed message there. What's going on? What is actually going on? So to be able to put that product out and say you're going to have 40 or 50 mile or 60 mile an hour wind gust and calling it what it is, a tropical storm, really helps us message consistent with the National Hurricane Center.
And so talking about the threats of tropical systems in western North Carolina, we can see anything from flooding to, like you said, winds. Tornadoes are even a big threat. So kind of talk about that and what we specifically see. I know flooding may be a bigger concern in the mountains with the upslope and even landslides.
Well, sure, certainly flooding is probably the overall biggest risk. From the mountains, you get the upslope, as you mentioned. Tremendous amounts of rainfall can fall from a tropical system anyway. You throw that upslope component where the wind's blowing up the mountains, it just wrings out more of the moisture. So just in the last couple of years, we've had several events that really caused a lot of rainfall in that Blue Ridge area. And so certainly you can get flash flooding, you can get river flooding, slides, landslides like you're talking about, mudslides, and those can be dangerous to people. And so those are things that we're actually trying to work with the North Carolina Geological Survey to get a better handle on how that happens. Still a long way from really truly understanding all the factors that go into it, but those are things we're working on.
Absolutely, and that's only just a part of the many complexities that GSP has to deal with when you guys are forecasting.
Sure.
Everything from northwest flow and the upslope, rainfall events. Can you just kind of give us a general overview on really what's the toughest part, the toughest maybe system to forecast in our area?
Okay, well, I would probably go to winter weather if I could. I think that you can get the cold air moving in from the north to the south. You can also have the elevation differences, and you can also have the cold air damming, where the cold air kind of banks up against the Appalachians. So factoring all that into what the precipitation's moving into the area, what is the precip type going to be? Is it going to be all snow? Is it going to be a mixture? And getting those amounts right, and actually where that transition zone is going to be is probably our biggest challenge.
Absolutely. Like you said, the transition zone is typically kind of in unfortunate places where it's, we have Charlotte, where a lot of times North Charlotte, and matter of fact, this year we just saw that, where North Charlotte got a couple inches of snow and South Charlotte got diddly squat.
Right, exactly. Roughly, people say roughly along the I-85 corridor. It's not exact, of course, and it varies by storm. But the same thing down in the Greenville-Spartanburg area, in addition to Charlotte, is your largest population centers are located right along that line. And so, you shift your rain snow line or sleet or freezing rain 10 miles or 20 miles, you're impacting, in the case of Charlotte, 1 million people or more. Okay. In the case of Greenville-Spartanburg, maybe half that. So it's a big challenge.
And talking about the cold air damming events as well as northwest flow events, those are two events that are rather unique, actually explicitly unique to the GSP area and this kind of section of North and South Carolina. Is there any research going on to kind of help us understand those further? Because I know they cause significant, even sometimes forecast bust, just because it's really tough to forecast those and no one really knows exactly what to do.
Sure, there actually has been a lot of research in recent years. I mean, I can't point to anything that started just recently, but in recent years to try to, especially out of like NC State and some of those C-STAR projects that they've done, to try to figure out what is it that causes the cold air damming and exactly how to do it. The challenges are 32 degrees versus 31 degrees versus 33. It's just right on that line that's so tough. And usually that's right where we are. As far as northwest flow, of course, really what you're doing on the northwest side is just upsloping just like you are on the southeast side, except it tends to be colder and less moisture, so you don't get the extreme amounts of precipitation, but you can get several inches of snow, in some cases 5-6 inches along the Tennessee border in the western North Carolina mountains. So really it's the same process. It just takes effect in different ways, different parts of the area.
Absolutely.
And so Steve, as we wrap up here, for the folks in your weather office, what are you guys focusing on as we come into this active tropical season? We've had an already active severe weather season with you guys have already had to do some tornado surveys. So what are we looking at? So what are you guys focusing on as we get into these active summer months?
Well, certainly the next few months will be the afternoon thunderstorms that are going to pop up just about every day. And they're going to pop up over the mountains, the Blue Ridge. In most cases, they'll drop either or move east or southeast into the upstate of South Carolina or the Piedmont of North Carolina and into the Charlotte area on many days. And those will be, I'll call it locally severe. And a local severe storm could, a downburst, a little hail. Not going to be widespread in most cases. tornadoes or anything like that, but certainly can bring some trees down, can be dangerous. So that's the next few months, and then beyond that, we'll be training as we go into the next as we go into the tropical season. Hopefully it's a quiet season, but we have to be prepared either way. So we'll be looking for the latest policy updates, the latest training, latest tools that we can use to try to provide the best forecast we can, and then just trying to message and communicate things, what the risks are, which is kind of what this event's doing.
So I think we're all hoping for a quiet season. Steve, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thank you. All right, we're here with Chief Meteorologist at WBTV, Eric Thomas. Eric, friendly face to most of us in the Carolinas.
Hope so. Yeah, I try to keep a smiling face on as often as possible, except for when the severe weather rolls through.
That's right. So we're out here at the Charlotte Airport, the Hurricane Awareness Tour. You've been here in the Carolinas for, 30-some years?
I'm going to hit 31 years this fall. I was introduced at the Greek Festival in 1989. So 1988. Yeah, I'm getting old. Yeah.
So you've had your fair share with hurricanes. Obviously, Hugo sticks out. Tell us a little bit about that, and maybe some other hurricanes that kind of stick out to you.
Hurricane Hugo was interesting because, I got here in the fall of '88, and in November of '88, they had that F4 tornado up in Raleigh. And next thing I know, I'd barely got my feet on the ground, and I'm in a helicopter flying over this tornado damage and thinking, oh my goodness, what have I gotten myself into? So I got through that, and then '89 rolled around, and here comes Hurricane Hugo. And I have to tell you, we were woefully under-equipped back then in the weather department. We actually, when I got here, I was the first meteorologist to ever work at WBTV. So at the same time that I got there, they were feverishly trying to bring in the weather equipment that would allow me to really do my job as a meteorologist. So at that point, we really didn't have any real analytical equipment. So I was a slave to just this little sheet of 1 page of surface weather maps from AccuWeather to kind of like look at this and go, oh, gee, there's a cold front, there's a warm front, and that looks like a hurricane. And so, we had the little 300 baud weather ticker back then, tick, 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 bringing up the data. And so, but to their credit, AccuWeather, as this storm was getting closer, was letting us know, look, this thing has got a very fast forward speed. It was like coming into the coast at around 35, 40 miles per hour. And the problem with that is you got a Category 4 hurricane down there, and this thing is going to be up in Charlotte, within 4, 5, 6 hours. That's not much time for a Cat 4 to spin down, is it?
Right.
And so we were warning people, look, this is going to be different than most of the coastal hurricanes in the past. And we were feverishly trying to tell people to tie everything down, get ready, this is not going to be good. Even with that, though, we had no idea that it was going to create the amount of destruction that it did. I remember when the first light came up, and I was there all night, and we looked out the windows out of the radio station that we have there, and my jaw just dropped because it seemed like there must have been 95, 100 pine trees that were just mowed down. It looked like Godzilla had come through. It was unbelievable. And then, of course, the rest is history. We've always heard about how people were without power for 3 weeks. You hear the sounds of chainsaws buzzing in the air, week after week. I remember when I was trying to get home that day, and it took me a long time to get home because of all the blocked roads, that, the very first intersection that I came to, right at the bottom of our hill, there was a National Guardsman there with his M16 machine gun, in the intersection. And that's when it really hit me. I thought, it feels like I am in a war zone here. And that's what it was, with just the complete destruction of the infrastructure around Charlotte, and all the trees down, the roads blocked, stores closed, nobody could get gas, and it was just really intimidating, to be a part of that as a citizen. And then after that, of course, all the cleanup and the recovery began.
Most hurricanes that we have to deal with here, tropical systems, bring the flooding threat. 2004 comes to mind, Francis and Ivan, especially up in the foothills. We had a lot of flooding up there. Last year, Hurricane Florence with flooding. So talk to us about some of the bigger floods that you've covered here.
I would say the biggest one, hands down, was, of all things, Hurricane Danny. And Danny came in, that was 1997, and it came into Mobile, Alabama. And you're thinking at that point, big deal. That's not going to be a situation for us. And it kind of wobbled, of course, a weekend as a tropical storm, and it just kind of wobbled across Alabama, and then made its way into Georgia, and then finally it got up into Charlotte. And overnight, Danny dropped 12 inches of rain in 12 hours right on top of Center City, Charlotte. And we had lakes, where there are normally just roads and parking lots around Charlotte. Charlotte was just paralyzed, from this flooding. And you may remember this. That's also when that locomotive fell down into the Little Sugar Creek because the whole trestle collapsed from the enormous amount of rushing water just eroding away, the natural trestle, that thing was on. In fact, there was even a lawsuit, over that because of the engineer was hurt and things like that. But that is probably the most impressive flood that I remember. Now, of course, I remember some floods up in the foothills, which, of course, that's your territory. It seems like, where was it? Collettsville, Caldwell County. But I think that might have just been a summertime thunderstorm there. Yeah, that's right. I'm trying to remember. But no question, Danny was the most impressive flood, at least close to Charlotte, in my 31 years.
And so, as we wrap up here, this is a diverse area where you work. We have anywhere between major ice storms, tornadoes, tropical systems. Talk to us about the forecast area here in western North Carolina, the upper regions of South Carolina.
Well, I mean, you know what any meteorologist is going to tell you. If you ask him where is the hardest place to forecast, he'll always tell you where I am. But maybe I can actually make a case for that because I heard a climatologist one time say that there is a greater diversity of weather across North Carolina from, say, the western tip to the coast than anywhere else on the earth. I think it's like in a tie with somewhere over in Asia. But you cannot, there is not one weather element that you can name that doesn't occur in our area. I mean, whether it's hurricanes, ice storms, lightning, hail. Look at the wind that we had. We had a fatality here just a week or two ago in the sky, under sunny skies, with this massive wind field that came through. So, you have the snow, the hurricanes, the tornadoes. I mean, there's nothing that you can name that we don't have here. So it for me, that's not a complaint. It's a fascinating place to forecast, and it certainly keeps you on your toes. And obviously the mountains are a huge factor because, when you're trying to track these air masses coming in from the west. A lot of times, they'll get blocked or heavily modified, or vice versa. When you get the cold air damming coming down from the coast, the mountains once again, they set that whole situation up. So it's challenging, and I love the challenge.
It's fun. Well, Eric, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, Scotty. Good to see you. Take care.
That does it for this special edition of the Carolina Weather Group. We hope you have a happy and safe 4th of July weekend. If you're watching us right now, don't forget you can check us out on your favorite podcast app and listen to us while you travel. Or if you're listening to us on the podcast edition already, don't forget to check out the show notes for links to our all-new features, including voice memos and ways that you can financially support the Carolina Weather Group. On behalf of everyone at the Carolina Weather Group, I'm James Brierton in Charlotte, wishing you a happy and safe 4th of July. We'll see you back here next Wednesday night at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time for our all-new edition of the Carolina Weather Group.
Okay, everybody. Make sure my volume is up. Looks like I'm good to go. This time, I'm going to make sure to move my head out the way. From last night's episode, I'm sure many of you were frustrated as I went on for about 10-15 minutes and blocked the screen. But tonight, we're going to talk about Hurricane Dorian that's strengthening in the Atlantic right now. So it is Wednesday, August the 28th, about 8:45, almost 8:50 p.m. Once again, meteorologist Shay Gibson here to give you a synopsis on Hurricane Dorian. Let me go ahead and minimize myself while I remember now down here to the corner. And here is the 8 o'clock or 8:06 p.m. NHC update on Dorian. The first thing I want to talk about is Aaron. This is Tropical Depression Aaron spinning off the Outer Banks coast. Now the track of Aaron does take it off to the northeast in time. It may hit parts of Nova Scotia. It may reform as a tropical storm. There is a warm body of water up this way. So it does have a chance of reforming as a tropical storm as it heads off to the northeast. So we'll be watching that carefully. But one thing I want to point out with Aaron is you can see the convective blob up here off the Outer Banks coastline. And what's trailing down below is a trough. It's a large trough,
and this upper low that's spinning just out to the northwest of Dorian and this trough are going to join. Now that's going to head off to the west, but that's going to have some effect in the pull of Dorian in time. So I wanted to point that out, but this is Aaron right now, not looking very impressive at all. It's got a lot of dry air entrainment along the western and northern sides of it, so most of the convection is staying to the south and to the southeast of the storm. So back to the NHC. Let's go ahead and take a look at Dorian. The current winds are 80 miles per hour. The pressure has dropped to 990 millibars, so we know that the storm is intensifying. The latest track for this does bring it over into Florida, so the track is starting to tighten up just a little bit. There's still about a 200-mile margin of error, so if we look at the forecast track line down the middle, we don't want to focus right down the middle of this thing because we could have about 200 miles. What the NHC is saying is 200 miles of error at this point. It's so far out that it could jog to the south or even jog to the north by this much from the center of the line. So we've got to keep that in mind, but we do know that the storm is intensifying. If we look at the wind alert storm track, the NHC does bring it into the coast of Florida in time as a Category 3. That's what they're calling for right now, and that makes it a significant storm to be having impacts on that area or any part of the United States as a whole. But the Bahamas look like they're going to get largely passed around. This storm did jog to the north. Let's take a quick look at Dorian right now, and this is on the imagery here. We can see that the storm largely missed Puerto Rico. They got really lucky because the mid-level low over the top of the storm, let me move myself out the way there again a little bit. The displacement of the mid-level low over the surface low pulled that storm to the north, so there was a little bit of a jog up through the Virgin Islands to somewhat of a surprise for some of those folks, as the storm wasn't expected to jog that far north. It was supposed to actually head a little bit more west-northwest or northwest and cut right across Puerto Rico. So we saw that jog today, and now it's cleared the area and it's heading into the Atlantic just east of the Bahamas. This water is very warm. The upper shear is relaxed, so this storm does have a good chance to rapidly, I wouldn't say rapidly intensify yet, that may be a big word, but it is intensifying as we speak. We do expect to see some upgrades on this overnight and possibly get into a Category 2. The NHC is calling for a Category 3 within 72 hours, so we're going to hold them to that. But you can see an explosion of cloud tops here where it shows significant convection trying to get wrapped around the center. It's not quite there yet. Looking on radar out of Puerto Rico, you can see a distinct eye wall wrapped around the core. It's just covered by some of this dense overcast around the storm as the cloud tops are pushing in all directions. It's kind of closing in on the core of it, but we'll probably see some eye wall replacement cycles occurring over the next 24 to 48 hours as the storm continues to intensify. If we look at the mimic, this is the morphed integrated microwave imagery as it passed into the Eastern Caribbean and up over the Virgin Islands. We see that eye wall really forming off to the north of it, and even in the last frame here, it's not quite up to date, but you can see it kind of condensing around the core. But this is pretty neat because you can actually see the eye developing just as it passes to the east of Puerto Rico, and it has a little bit of a wobble there, probably due to some of the mountainous terrain, giving it a little bit of a circuitous wobble up and around the mountain range. So we do expect that the system may continue to head off to the north or even north-northwest. Once again, we're looking at this trough, this upper level low, and the troughing diving down to the west of it. This upper level low may pull the storm a little bit more to the northwest or north-northwest in time up and around it, and then as time goes on, it'll be guided off to the west-northwest and even to the west, and we'll get into that in just a minute. Let me go ahead and take a look at the forecast tracks. There's majority of the tracks from the 6 p.m. update show a majority of these models are pulling this into Florida at this point. There's a couple of outliers that bring it to the north, and we're not closing the door on that just yet. And what that has to do with excuse me, is we see Aaron out here off the coast, and as it jogs to the north, we see high pressure starting to build in from the Atlantic. This ridge is significant because of the clockwise motion around it. This is going to be driving surface to mid-level winds around and from the east and driving the storm into the coast of Florida. That's what we think of right now, and that's what the NHC is sticking with. In time, we'll see that track start to tighten up, and even the intensity starting to get a little bit more certain. Right now, there's still a little bit of uncertainty about the intensity of the storm overall, but if we look at the Euro model from today, we go back to 0 hours. Here's Aaron, and the storm comes over. We see this ridge really building to the north and driving it into the coast. So the Euro is a little bit more bullish about keeping this into the central to southern Florida portions and then into the Gulf. And of course, that was the 12 o'clock run from today. So the next run will be midnight. We'll get a little bit more guidance from that. It may go a little bit further north. But If it re-enters into the Gulf, it may reform again, and then as it heads north, we may have another situation along the northern Gulf Coast there as well. Either way, I think a lot of the southeast region will be feeling this as it curves back into the coastline. There is a cold front dropping in that is supposed to pick it up and pull it out to sea, but not before doing some damage across Florida and up around into the southeast region, according to the Euro. Going to the GFS, this is the 6 o'clock run today. The initialization period for this wasn't the best. It hasn't been doing the best on the short term, but I'm going to go ahead and use it anyways for a little bit of guidance. And here's Aaron off the coast. It goes up. We see that troughing diving to the south, high pressure moving in from the west, and then the ridge building out over the Atlantic. Now the GFS is also in agreement with the Euro model, building this ridge significantly to the north, enough to drive it to the west. Now, as far as the GFS has been a little bit further north of the Euro, and it did align today for a little bit, but we're not seeing exact agreement in that, and so that's why the forecast track has 200 miles in either way from the center, because there may be some error in that track because of this. And there's ensemble models as well that are showing this in the same kind of fashion. There's a lot more outliers and a lot of other possibilities, but the GFS keeps this more towards central to northern Florida, and then stalls out in the southeast region and slowly fizzles out. But there again, it's going to bring problems up into the southeast region no matter what because of the steering mechanism. There's going to be a cold front diving down, like I said. If we look at the WPC sea level pressure map, or the surface map, here's the cold front now. We go into Friday. We have another cold front dropping down from the north, and that is going to stall over the coastline. And then we have another one pulling in behind that. And this front that's going to sag down into the southeast region, more of an undulating front, is what's going to be helping to pull this out to sea in time. And we see that happen as it pops out over the ocean over here. That's what the WPC is saying for right now. But as far as forward motion, once it gets towards the west into the coastline, it's just a matter of where it's going to go from there. We don't know if it's going to go into the Gulf yet and come up to the north. We don't know if it's going to stay over Florida or curve up into Georgia. There's just still a lot of uncertainty. One thing I want to point out is the sea surface temperatures are very warm, which leads to tropical cyclone heat potential. We talked about that a little bit last night, where we talked about the surface of the water being very warm. We're talking 84 to 86 degrees, 87 in some spots. And you look at the surface water, and then you look at the depth of that. And so the deeper the water is warm, the more fuel it's going to have. So if a storm is moving at a pretty good clip over it, it's going to have plenty of fuel. If it slows down, sometimes it gets some cool water upwelling, which will help to sort of fade it out a little bit. But it doesn't look like that's going to be the case for this. In fact, if we look a little bit closer in, we can see these warm waters. Any of these shaded areas basically signify that there's plenty of heat potential for this storm to gain some strength off of. Looking at the Saffir-Simpson scale for Category 3, we're talking about winds of 111 to 129 miles per hour. Devastating damage will occur. The storm surge, it's a little bit early to call a storm surge for anything just yet, so we're not going there. But you could range anywhere from 10 to 15 feet on that, maybe even a little bit higher. It just depends on where it makes landfall as to what the storm surge will be as it goes up on the coastal shelf water. Sometimes that surge lowers, but still, like I said, a little too early to start talking about that. What we're really concerned about is this track heading into Florida. So the folks in Florida, if you're anywhere from Miami all the way up to Jacksonville, I would go ahead and have your plan ready, because it looks like there's a lot of agreement, a large-scale agreement, that this storm will be making landfall. The intensity has yet to really be determined. The NHC is calling for a Category 3 at this point, but could it be 4 or 5? Yes. Could it be a 2? Yes. It's just uncertain until it gets actually over these waters and develops. And you see that northwesterly track, what I was talking about earlier, around that upper level low, and then that ridge to the north drives it over to the west-northwest. And so we're really concerned about the storm intensifying to a point where it becomes very dangerous for anywhere where it makes landfall. So that's pretty much the gist of it. I think what we have to consider is the ridge to the north. If that weakens a little bit, then the storm goes a little bit further north up the coastline. That looked like a little bit of more of a possibility as of last night, but today it looks like that's a less likely possibility to happen. Looks like the majority consensus is taking this over to the west. So let me see if I can take some questions here. Let me scroll down. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up on my phone, because I can actually get more questions involved there. See if I can find it. I'm just going to scroll down. I know there's a lot of questions, and I do apologize for those of you who've been messaging me all day. I just haven't been able to get to all of the messages that are out there. and somewhat of an overwhelming amount of them, but I'll answer any that I can whenever I can get to them. So I appreciate all of you joining tonight. And let's see here. Carolyn Bocci says, keep it away from Ormond by the Sea. Okay, yeah, I'm not sure exactly where Ormond by the Sea is, but yeah, I don't want it to hit land. I mean, I would rather this not be heading to land at all. Marilyn Browder, yep, you're very welcome. Let's see. Vicky Boggs Futchall asks, is it going to stall out or it stalls out? And that's going to be the big question, is what happens once it moves into land somewhere over Florida. We're pretty certain at this time. But there still are a few possibilities for a door to the north, or maybe even a little bit of a door to the south. The Euro is bringing a little bit south. As far as where it goes once it gets over Florida, it looks like there isn't a lot of steering mechanism of that ridge to the north. The stronger winds driving it end up fading over time. So that's the problem, is it doesn't really have anywhere to go until that cold front drops down and it actually has some steering mechanism to pull up and out. We're hoping it'll curve up and out to sea quicker without reforming in the Gulf and have another landfall. That would be a worst case scenario where we have two landfalls of a major hurricane, because the warm waters in the Gulf are very warm as well, and the shear may be relaxed in that area to help it intensify even more once it crosses over. Usually once they go over land, they weaken significantly, so it may not be very much once it comes out on the other side, if that happens. So a lot of different possibilities right now, but the main thing is that this is expected to curve over and make a landfall in the United States. Okay, let's see here. Al McGreer, you're very welcome. And let's see. Jerry Altman, thanks for the compliment, much appreciated. Jason Drake, you're very welcome. Let's see. Lauren Grove, Jim Kraft. Hey Jim, how you doing? My buddy from work. Appreciate you coming on tonight. Any reports out of USVI yet? Damage? Actually, yeah, there was some damages today. There was a lot of wind, heavy rainfall. In fact, let me go back to the wind alert and show you this. One of the gusts down here at one of our weather flow sensors, and this is just south. Let me see if I can find it here. Buck Island. This is the highest recorded wind that we got today. Now, this sensor sits about 90 feet above sea level. It says 40 feet above ground right here, but the sensor overall sits up on a kind of a hilltop, so it's 90 feet up, so the wind speeds are biased at that height. They tend to be higher the higher up you go. When you get to like 850 millibars and you start getting up a little bit higher into like 2,000, 3,000 feet, you get some really strong winds up there, but as they get down to the surface, they get a little bit weaker. But we did have a wind gust of 110 miles per hour at about 1:20 p.m. today, so that was recorded by the NHC, and that was one of the reasons they upgraded it to a Category 1 hurricane from this weather sensor alone, plus their hurricane recon going out and getting readings. So all of that information together had the NHC upgrade this to a hurricane just as it was going over the Virgin Islands. So yeah, some damages, some power outages I've heard, and you know, I shared this video to that group, What's Up St. Thomas, and I hope that everybody down there is okay. It seemed like a real big surprise when that storm jogged to the north. It took a lot of folks by surprise. There were no hurricane warnings until just this morning when it actually was making landfall up that way. Let's see here. Tina, you're welcome. I appreciate the question this morning. David Connor asked, what is the forecast as the storm gets into the Gulf? And I sort of answered to that. We look at the Gulf waters, and I'll pull that up real quick, because sea surface temperatures are a huge factor, especially in the Gulf. And a lot of these areas where the storm is going into, and even over into the Gulf, have been largely undisturbed from any tropical systems, tropical waves. Not a lot of activity to really cool those waters down, so they've been pretty warm for some time. But we go to sea surface temperatures, and you can see the reds on there. I mean, we're talking in the mid to upper 80s in the Gulf of Mexico. So anything that heads here, if there's relaxed upper shear aloft, and it has time to sit over water for a day or so, it may reform, re-intensify, and that's a scary thing. We saw that Hermine, we've seen storms do that right before they come up and around Florida and then head up the coast into the northern Gulf states, that it does have significant intensification right before it makes landfall. We saw that with Michael last year too. It was pretty impressive. But this one, if it goes further south across Miami and cuts across less land, and ends up in the Gulf over here and then turns north, that could be a real problem. So hopefully that answers your question, David. That's probably a worst case scenario. I'd rather not happen. Elbow Key, Bahamas. I have friends with property. Dan Volpe asks, well, it looks like it's going to be going largely around the Bahama Island chain, at least the southern, southeastern Bahamas, and maybe cutting across Nassau and these areas to the north. So anywhere where you see in the track here is subject to being impacted by the storm, especially along the southern side of the system. Right now, I believe the hurricane force winds, if I go back to the National Hurricane Center, let me see if I can find in the discussion. Sometimes it mentions it down there how far out the winds are. See 15 to 20 nautical mile I, but it doesn't say how far out the winds go. Earlier the tropical storm force winds were going out to about 80 miles and the hurricane force winds out to 20 miles. So that's probably larger now, and that's yet to be determined. So we don't really know for sure just yet as far as like how wide that was going to be. And it's going to be a pretty close call for those northern Bahamas, I will say that. Tallahassee chances, Karen Rowe? I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be able to push that far inland. And even if it does, it would probably weaken where it would just be maybe some squall-like weather, but nothing crazy. I don't think it's going to be able to push that far inland into Tennessee. Let's see here. Carolyn Bocce, we're slightly north of Daytona Beach, Florida. Well, that's, going back to the track, that's, you're definitely in the cone right here, and you're probably about 75 to 80 miles north of the center there, and we'd have a 200-mile error in track judgment on this. So Daytona Beach is right there. So I would be considering or at least watching this daily 2-3 times a day to find out if there's going to be evacuations ordered or what sort of preparations you may need. Hopefully everybody in Florida is prepared. As many hurricanes and storms that go across that state, hopefully most people are prepared for hurricanes and know what to do in evacuations. So Sid Schuler, you're very welcome. Thanks for watching and being a fan here. Jason Pott asks, what kite for Sunday? Jason, I'm not sure where you are, but if you're in Tampa Bay, yeah, it depends on where the storm is. I'm not sure exactly. Let's go back to the track and find out where we're talking about on days. So 2 p.m. by Monday, they're saying by 2 p.m. Monday could be in central Florida. So by Sunday, you may not be feeling very much out of that. Maybe a northeast wind wrapping around it if you're in the Tampa Bay area, but I'm pretty sure if we have a Category 3 hurricane, you're going to be in excess of 100 miles an hour, and that would be even precipitating across the state, where the winds would be, the gradient would be increasing, where you'd be getting 30 to 50 mile an hour winds over on the other side, even going over land and diving down over the Bay Area. So not really sure. I wouldn't suggest kiteboarding in a tropical storm or a hurricane just because of the variability it has in the storming and tornadoes and lightning and all the other things that come with it. But let's see, who else we got here? Eason said, he says, passed over St. Croix and St. Thomas. What caused the shift in the track? And I did discuss that a little bit earlier. If we go back to the imagery here, what we had was when the system was coming across St. Lucia, it was a small, compact tropical storm. It really was. It was not the most organized system whatsoever, and the low-level center of circulation was a little bit displaced to the south of the mid-level circulation. So typically what you have in a tropical storm or hurricane is the ideal situation is you have a surface low, then you have a mid-level low on top of it, and then you have high pressure on top of that, and that's the exhaust system. And so when those are misaligned, when the mid-level low is not aligned over the surface low and the high is built off to another direction, which it was, then you don't really get a whole lot of convective activity or concentration on the core. And so what happens is the mid-level low sometimes will drag the surface low underneath it. And so when the mid-level low jogged off to the north, it pulled the surface low to the north with it. And that's what caused that jog. So it's pretty significant in the forecast track where the NHC had it going across central Puerto Rico and pretty much a direct hit. And that jog really kind of threw things off a little bit. So that's why that happened. That's pretty tough call there. I'm not feeling the best about it because a lot of us were kind of following the track, and folks in the islands were kind of looking at all the forecasters. And these are the tricky things about these tropical systems is sometimes they just have a mind of their own, and they're going to do what they want to. They don't really they don't think, reason, or anything like that. We can do all the modeling we want to, and then they get one little wobble in it, and it throws off the whole track by a few hundred miles. So hopefully you guys are okay down there. Karen Rowe asked whether the chances it can hang out in the Gulf and go towards Louisiana. Well, that's not off the table yet. The Euro was showing that. In fact, we go back to the Euro here, and we see that it cuts across Florida, and this is as of Monday morning, and then reforms out in the Gulf and intensifies, and then heads north. Looks like it's going to stay to the east of Louisiana. I think that this cold front dropping down, this troughing, will help to drag this away from that. I'm not seeing that possibility right now, but then again, in the next couple of days, you may see some other scenarios coming forth. You may see that the storm pulls further west than we thought, or maybe the ridge weakens and it pulls further north. So still uncertain. We're still, several days out. When you get to 5-6 days out, the margin of error increases greatly in our forecasting. So that's hopefully if that helps you at all for right now. We'll probably know in a couple of days what's going to happen there. John Papadaro says power's still out. New growth took a beating, but all okay. And I'm assuming you're in the Virgin Islands, so yeah, I assume a lot of folks in those islands lose power even with a tropical storm or when the winds get pretty gusty down there. So hopefully you guys will be all right and you get power restored and life back to normal pretty soon. I don't see anything on the horizon behind that in the Atlantic and the main development region, so everything looks okay for right now. Okay, let's see. Jamie Brown asked about boats in the hill in Palm Beach getting repowered. Good place. Yeah, Palm Beach. I'm not sure that's such a good place, Jamie, but hopefully they'll secure the boat where it'll be okay. I don't know what to tell you there. That's somebody asked me earlier, would you think it'd be okay to drive to Palm Beach on Saturday? Is it going to be safe? Like trying to get ahead of the storm to get down to that area, and I wouldn't recommend that just because of the track of the storm. And probably there's going to be some evacuations. If the track holds, you're going to see a lot of folks packing. It's going to be kind of chaotic down there. I wouldn't suggest heading down to Florida. In fact, I'd be trying to get away from it. So, for all intents and purposes, I know it's Memorial Day weekend, but you don't really want to put yourself in a dangerous situation with a major hurricane possibly making landfall over the weekend. And the NHC says over Memorial Day weekend, so we don't know if it could speed up its forward progress and make it there by Saturday or even Sunday or Monday. So, yeah, there again, a little bit of uncertainty on the timing. Let's see, who else has some questions here? Karen, you're welcome. Chad, Carson, how you doing, man? Thanks for coming in. Good to see you again. A lot of old friends here, man. This is good. I like to see a lot of folks popping in and asking questions. And here I'm going to put this back on the screen while I scroll through a few more questions. Ty Luckett asks, even if it goes to the Panhandle of Florida, is it possible Cape Hatteras will get rain and weather? And that has yet to be determined. That's way far out. If it goes across Florida beyond that, we're getting a week out, 10 days, where if it curves to the north and follows that cold front up across the southeast, it looks like it's going to be a slower track. It doesn't look like it's really going to race off anytime soon. But could OBX, if it comes back out in the Atlantic and reforms, I mean, that's a way down the road scenario to think about. But I think it would fizzle out before we get to OBX with that kind of southerly track. Okay, Bernie Sabo watching from Charlotte. Hey, Bernie, I hope you're not going to be in Tampa Bay during that time. So I know you live down there. You live just north of Tampa Bay. So hopefully you and your family and friends and everybody are going to be all right. Nathan Cruz, very welcome, Nathan. Good to see you on. Let's see here. Sanibel Island, Leslie Browder, Newland asked, what about Sanibel? And that's on the western coast. And I would say, these wraparound winds when you get into Florida, let me pull this up right here. So you got to think counterclockwise motion around the system. And so wherever it goes, if it's to the south, you'll see more of a northerly wind diving down. And then as the storm goes across, you'll see a southerly wind kicking back up. And so the winds will be coming from several different directions. You're talking about, especially over the peninsula of Florida, you're going to start out with probably northeast winds really starting to crank up, maybe starting out a little bit east out ahead of it, and then cranking up from the northeast and then around from the north, and then swirling around back from the southwest into the coastline. And then if it comes out into the Gulf, you'll be getting a straight southerly flow along that west coast. But there again, that possibility, that would be what would happen is you get winds from all different directions, especially across the peninsula area. Now, if it heads a little further north, you're going to get more of just a wraparound easterly northeast flow, and then in that case, you would get a west flow down across the Tampa Bay, Sanibel, all these areas down here. So that tends to occur. You just got to think of counterclockwise motion around the storm, and that's where the winds are going to be. But there again, we're a little far out, and we have to watch and see what this track does to see what those winds are going to be doing. I'm interested to see what the higher resolution models that come into play. We see the Euro model. This is a coarse resolution global model, and the GFS as well. The ones that we start looking for as we get closer in time are the NAM12, the HRR for precipitation. The NAM3 is very high resolution. This gives us out to about 3 days, 4 days for the NAM12, and then we get to where about 84 hours on the NAM3 anyways, where we can get some better modeling. It starts to incorporate more into it, like the soundings and the wire temperatures, the more micro scale. So that's what we start to look for. There are a couple of hurricane models out there, but they're reading something really vicious, and I don't even want to throw up here because sometimes that just causes panic, unnecessary panic. But you know, we can't exclude everything. We just don't want to put all kinds of crazy scenarios out on the internet and say, hey, you know, this is going to be a massive Category 5 when we just don't know that yet. Okay, let's see here. Tina Kurd says FEMA is responding, and I'm assuming for the USVI. Yeah, if you're asking questions about your territory or you know, mentioning things about it, just pop in where you are. That way I know exactly where you are. It helps to have that information to shell out to everybody. Hey, Amanda, and my wife's chiming in. Nice forecast. Thank you for joining. Much appreciated. She's in the other room probably laughing at me right now. Okay, let's see. Keisha Soto Sanchez, what should we expect in Charleston if it does end up curving north? And that goes back to the forecast track and that counterclockwise motion. We're looking at pretty much all weekend. We're going to have high pressure driving down behind a cold front, some east-northeast to east winds throughout pretty much the entire weekend. And it's going to be a moderate gradient for the Charleston area. We're looking at probably low to mid-teens in knots along the Barrier Island beaches. And if the storm does take a more northerly track, that gradient will only increase in time as we get into Saturday, Sunday. So that means the winds will climb and they'll start getting into the upper teens to low 20s. And then if it comes closer, if it's in Jacksonville, then we'll have winds probably coming up even higher than that, maybe into the 30s and 40s. It's really early to call numbers right now, but what I'm saying is the general trend would be from the east, maybe even southeast, wrapping around the storm. Depends on the size of the system too. If it's really big, you may just have an easterly wind, but if it sort of shrinks and more compact, then you end up with an outward gradient that's more southeast. So yeah, I would say we're going to be transitioning from the east-northeast over and veering east or southeast by the time it goes to our south. So either way, we could have strong winds or we could have weaker winds depending on how far north or south it does go. So hopefully that helps you out, and that goes for you too as well, Lisa Greer and Hilton Head. Same thing there. If it stays on this center track or even the Daytona or St. Augustine, we'll probably see some wraparound outer banding of the storm, making it maybe all the way up to Charleston. That's a far stretch at this point, but any northward track would bring more of that banding up, so banding and squalls, so maybe a few showers. One thing I would be concerned about is the tide. So, and this is going to go for all the coast. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this up. This is the extratropical storm water table, and this is for the Charleston area. And pretty much we're going to have higher than normal high tides. We're going to have high astronomical tides actually for the next several days, just because of Aaron out to sea pushing swell in. We're going to have our tides in the last several years have gotten very sensitive. We have some sea level rise involved with that. And so now our tides are very sensitive, where you get one storm out there, some strong winds, and then we end up with higher than normal tide. And in our case, we got up to flooding tonight. There were some areas of town that flooded over in the roadways, and there's no storms or rain. I mean, there was some rain earlier, some thunderstorms, but this is tide driven alone. And so the National Weather Service Charleston is keeping these up all the way through Saturday and maybe even Sunday. But if we start to see this table come into play in a few days, where we have Dorian coming into play, and we saw that with Irma, even 300 miles to the south, kicking swell all the way up here and flooding out. We could end up with tides over 10 feet just even being on the outskirts of the storm. So that's a really big concern for us in the Charleston area, even up to South Carolina, North Carolina, southern North Carolina as well, the Outer Capes. That's definitely something to keep an eye on if you live along the coast in some of these flooded areas and in some of these neighborhoods around Charleston that flood. And even down into Georgia and Savannah, I know Tybee Island's known for some huge floods down there. So be aware that we may have a real bad situation with flooding either way. We're going to be feeling some impacts from this storm. It's just a matter of how much and where. Okay, let's see here. Brian McCaskill, no, we don't want to nuke hurricanes. Probably not a good time to discuss nuking hurricanes, because then we'll just end up with radioactive fallout, because the wave window is from the southeast, and also higher than normal high tides, excessive higher than normal high tides. So yes, I would definitely be concerned about that. Michael Scarfile, yes, you're very welcome. Thanks for chiming in. Let's see here. Tides in the Gulf Coast. Well, Nathan, we saw, I'm trying to think of the storm. It was Irma. When it came around the tip of Florida, it got some effect from Cuba, which weakened it. But as it came around the tip of Florida, you have that offshore flow, which caused negative tide surge. So instead of having a tide surge into the coast, you end up with a negative tide surge. So if you have northeast winds driving that water out of the west coast waterways, like Tampa Bay or even further north, you may have water pushed out. And that there again, it falls along with the track. So if you get water that goes out and then the storm enters into the Gulf of Mexico, then you get the surge back in around that wraparound flow. And so that's a concern. I remember when folks were walking out into those areas, it was like, well, you better be careful because that water could come back in pretty quick on that wraparound flow. But Irma really did hug into the coastline, and we didn't see that. So hopefully that answers your question. Sometimes with that offshore flow in that area, we get negative tide surge. And let's see here. Rick IOC, if it follows more southerly European track and travels over the shallow, hot Bahamian Plateau and deep water, very, very descriptive. I love Rick. Would this increase odds for greater strengthening beyond Cat 3? And the answer is yes. There is a possibility it could be stronger than a Cat 3. I don't want to call it yet because I'm sticking with the forecast from the NHC showing a Category 3. In fact, let me go back here as it nears the coast. Now, would it be able to undergo rapid intensification? Yes. Where would that happen? Maybe it's starting to happen right now. We saw a 10 millibar drop since today over the last 9 hours. So if we see another 10 millibar drop tonight at the 11 p.m. update, that may signal that it's rapidly intensifying. Will that hold? Sometimes the storms they'll ramp up to a Category 4 or 5 and then they'll quickly die down. And it really depends on the warm water, the upper shear, the steering mechanisms, everything involved. Sometimes you can get a little bit of dry air entrainment, so that ridge to the north may push a little dry air down into it to the northern quadrants, which may wrap into the center and keep it on the weaker side. I think that's what the NHC might be hedging on as far as dry air entrainment into a system. Whereas if it's heading into a moisture environment, it has more opportunity to stay a large storm for longer. We saw that with Michael as it intensified. There wasn't a lot of dry air entrainment into it. It just really went right up into the coast. But that's sort of apples to oranges coming from one body of water to another. We're talking about the Atlantic here versus the Gulf of Mexico. Two different dynamics there. Plus you have the loop current in the Gulf of Mexico that can feed those storms, and I don't think it's going to get any help from that because I don't think it's going to make it over that far. So let's see here. Jennifer Hale, yep, you're very welcome. I don't think, for the most part, for all these folks in Charleston, I'm already at the bottom of the questions here. I don't think Charleston has, for South Carolina, has a lot to worry about right now. We just need to be wary of it, right? We need to be wary of any changes in the track that are dramatic enough to increase the impacts over our area. But the more concern is for the Florida Peninsula. I would definitely say if you live in Florida, I wouldn't take any chances. The storm is likely to hit land somewhere along the Florida coast. So take it very seriously and don't wait till the last minute to get prepared. I wouldn't say go running out the storm by all the milk and eggs and everything, but you have a little bit of time. I mean, we're looking at Sunday, Monday, and so try to plan that out. Try to look at what the evacuation route would be and what your plan of action would be and what time. I know the last time for Irma, a lot of folks went north and there was jam ups and there was a lot of issues, but the roads are pretty wide. They're wider in South Carolina for any means, but try to do the best you can to plan that out. And let's see, Mary Lee Scott asked about Dorian to Charleston, and I think I just answered that. I'm not too concerned about that right now. What I am concerned about is, other than a direct hit or even a near miss or any of those things, is the tidal flooding that we're going to see. The increased swell heights, tidal flooding, rip currents will probably be bad this weekend and leading into where Dorian passes to our south. And I think the winds, if it does head to the further north up the coastline, our winds will increase, so we can add some winds to that. But as far as tidal surging, I don't think we'll see much out of that. I think that's going to be more localized to Florida. But the astronomical tide chart is going to be going up as the swells move into the coastline. So hopefully that answers your question. I don't see any more on here. I'm going to go ahead and sign off, but hopefully I answered everybody's questions. And just keep in mind, if you're in the southeast region, keep a good eye on this, because either way we're going to probably feel impacts, if not before or after it makes landfall, and then recurves back up into the southeast region. So folks in central Georgia, central South Carolina, even the upstates should be watching this as well. I would say anywhere up into the mountains, even up into North Carolina. If the storm does curve up from the Gulf and up across Georgia, or from Florida up across Georgia into South Carolina, it'll probably bring tropical storm force winds from many of these spots. In the very least, if it stays over land and even fizzles out from a major hurricane, it still takes a day or two for it to really weaken down to tropical storm, sometimes a little faster. But just be vigilant. Be watching this very closely. I'll be back on again. I'll try again tomorrow and then again Friday. So I'm going to try to come on every single day, but I'll be doing regular updates as well to try to keep you posted on what the latest is. But until next time, I don't see anything else forming behind this. Celeste Apple asks, and nope, I don't see anything else behind that. For right now, things look relatively quiet. Couple tropical waves that we're looking at, but nothing significant to be concerned about at this point. If you live in the Virgin Islands, you can take a break now and try to recoup. Puerto Rico got spared, so I'm sure a lot of folks are very relieved to see that happen. But either way, I'll go ahead and end the live feed here, and I'll catch you on the next live one. But stay tuned for the updates, and thanks a lot for watching, everybody. Have a good night.